Eddie, while I'm thinking about it, if you are able to lead us in 639 at the end, that would be a real good song. See if you know that song. You just might know that. Yeah, I could have called Eddie prior to today to let him know about that thought of leading that song, except that it's long distance from Nigeria to make a phone call. I actually purchased a special plan on my Verizon cell phone so that it wouldn't cost me like $3 a second to make a phone call. And the plan was a pretty expensive plan, but it allowed me to make a certain number of phone calls from Nigeria, just enough to be able to call Brenda maybe once a day and talk with her for 5 minutes and to send a few text messages. But in any case, I am so grateful to be back, home. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was attacked in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. It is a day that FDR said would be a day remembered that will live in infamy. 2,300 men died, and World War II began. However, the War Department was not surprised by the beginning of the war. The War Department had been gearing up for 1 or 2 years leading up to this time frame of when the attack occurred. Though the attack itself was a surprise, the fact that war was coming was not. So they had spent the year or so prior to that refitting various forms of cruise ships and passenger ships to become troop transports. Luxury liners that were designed to carry passengers in vacation that would carry 400 passengers had been refitted to be troop transports that would carry 1,000 troops. Coast Guard cutters had been refitted into becoming battle cruisers to escort such ships. And on January the 27th, the Dorchester, one of those fancy luxury cruise ships that had been refitted to become a troop transport, it, along with 2 other ships, along with 3 cruisers escorting them, left from New York City with 900 soldiers aboard the Dorchester. There was a chaplain that actually was a World War I hero that had retired, who volunteered to come back into the service. His name was George Fox, and he was on board the Dorchester, along with a couple other chaplains. Alex Good was a rabbi, Clark Pulling was a Lutheran preacher, and John Washington was a priest, and they volunteered to be chaplains on the Dorchester. As the ship was passing Greenland, late into the evening, the risk of sub-attack became real apparent. And so the captain ordered that everybody on board, all the soldiers, everyone, were to sleep fully clothed and with their life vests on. Well, there were 900 soldiers that were huddled together in the belly of this ship that was a hot steam ship, was its power. It was incredibly hot down in the hold of that ship. And so they disobeyed the orders, and virtually none of the soldiers slept with their clothes on or the life vests on. The only exception was with the chaplains. Chaplain Fox and Clark and Good and Washington slept with their clothes and vests on. And sure enough, about 2 o'clock in the morning, a U-boat put a torpedo through the side of the Dorchester. There were only about 2/3 of the men that actually made it to the deck. About 600 made it to the deck. All of them without life vests. The ship was sinking rapidly. The chaplains were on board on the deck, feverishly handing out all the deck life vests that they could get their hands on, until finally there were no vests left. There were only 2 functioning lifeboats. All the rest of them, because they were in the Greenland icy North Atlantic, they were frozen in place and unable to be launched. They had 2 lifeboats that they could launch, which meant as the sky was lit up with flares so they could see what they were doing, scads of soldiers were jumping from the ships into the icy waters, no life vests at all. So when the chaplains had run out of the deck life vests and men were jumping into the water, the chaplains at final point began taking off their own vests and putting their 4 vests on the last 4 men that they could find. Out of all of those that were on that ship, only 204 survived of the 900. None of them were the chaplains that survived. But one of the 200 survivors wrote afterwards a rather famous story in which it ends with, "The last thing I saw of the chaplains was they were kneeling on the bow as it went underwater." We are those chaplains. We right now stand as men and women of God who are capable of handing salvation to someone else. The wonderful thing about this is that as we're handing out life vests to others that they might be rescued from this earth, that right now the world is it's sinking fast, and those who are on this planet are perishing, and without that life preserver, they will indeed perish. And you and I have the ability to hand out those life preservers, to share with those that are perishing the opportunity for life. Dare we stand and watch as this earth sinks into the icy cold of darkness with those on this planet perishing in their sins? Dare we stand there and watch them as they perish and not try and hand them a life vest, even if it were to be our own? That is indeed what Jesus did. Handed His very own life vest that others might live. This is a story of incredible love about the Dorchester and its 4 chaplains. A love that has an unthinkable cost to it. Jesus spoke of such love, and the word is agape in the Greek, that means by its definition a love that sacrifices. It is a love that literally surrenders yourself that others might have. It is what those chaplains did. It is what Jesus did. It is what He commissions us to do. In John chapter 15 verse 14, Jesus said, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." There was a man that rescued a child that had fallen onto a New York City subway some time back that I read about. And the reporter was taking an interview with the guy, and here's what the fellow said. The fellow said, had I not done this, I too would have died. I would have been no good to myself had I not jumped to that subway to rescue that child. Another man in another story saw a car that had wrecked off a ravine into a river. The car was sinking fast, and there was a man inside that could not get out. A bystander dove into the river, went in, crashed the window, and got the man out. And again, later on in an interview, he said, I could not just stand there and watch this man perish under the water. I could not live with myself if I had done nothing but let him drown. Stories like that I could have gone on with many more stories that you and I can read about, of people who are willing to sacrifice everything that the perishing might survive, that those who without help were going to drown in sin. Let me tell you about an even greater love. Of all those people that rescued children from subways and drowning men from cars and drowning sailors on an icy Pacific Ocean, let me tell you of an even greater love, a divine love. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 5, Paul writes that God shows His own love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That is the irony of all this. In each of these stories, those who were being rescued were virtually innocent people. And the sacrifices were being made by those who cared for those they knew, or at least that they wanted to know. But in the story of Jesus Christ dying on the cross, He died for us while we were enemies of Christ. He goes on to say, for if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by His life. How dare we? How dare we? Sit in the comfort of our homes, ride in the comfort of our cars, and eat the meals of luxury while those around us are dying, while those around us are perishing. There are so many souls that would come to Jesus if we would just be willing to show them where the life vests are at. Do we have that love for the hurting and the broken? I'm telling you, my heart is broken for those who are dying in Groesbeck. For those that do not have Jesus, who are going to leave this world unprepared, my heart is broken. The lost are groping in darkness, and the question is, will we do anything about it? And it is not until we have the attitude of the Apostle Paul. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 9 and verse 1, I have a great sorrow and an unceasing anguish in my heart for those that are my kinsmen in the flesh, that they might be saved. Notice what motivated him. Listen to these words again. He says, I have a great sorrow and an unceasing anguish in my heart, that they might be saved. It is not until we have that great sorrow, until we have that great anguish of heart, that we'll be willing to relinquish our own vests that others might survive and live. In Romans chapter 10 and verse 1, Paul also said concerning the lost, "Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved." It needs to become your prayer and mine. On a daily basis, we need to be on our knees. As we're saying our morning prayers, asking God to bless our children and our grandchildren, as we're asking God to bless our lives and give us our needs, we need to be talking to God about those who are lost and dying in sin. And we need to do something about it. We can pray as though God is the only one that can do anything, because the reality is He is the only one that can do anything. But we need to pray as though it's all up to Him, but we need to act as though it's all up to us. Ultimately, somebody has to be handing out life vests. Until then, they're just hanging on the wall while the innocent are perishing. And you and I need to do something about it. You and I must have that sorrow and unceasing sadness. We are men with life preservers in a world that is a sinking ship. We need to do something about it and sharing that gospel with others. Here in Groesbeck, I see many who are hurting. Our church is heavily involved in benevolence and kindness and compassion in many ways. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 16, John writes that by this we know the love of God, that He laid down His life for us, and that's what I've been preaching about for the last several minutes. That Jesus laid down His life for the perishing, for us. Then he goes on to say this, though, "And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. If anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and yet closes up his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not just love in word or in talk, but let us love in deed and in truth." Start grabbing the life vests and start handing them out. You and I need to go to those that are perishing, and our heart needs to go out to them, or we'll never do it. We are the men with the life preservers on a world that is a sinking ship. But there is a second thing that comes to my mind. My heart was touched by what I saw this past week. Not only are there countless thousands and millions perishing in this nation, but I just spent a few weeks in Nigeria. Amidst a huge population of people, millions upon millions of people, a huge population with 6,000 churches of Christ, with a vast contrast between poverty and yet spiritual strength. They are men and women without money. They are Christians without means. They don't have hardly any life vests, if you will, to hand out. But they're doing it. One of my pleasures the past few weeks was to preach in the BB Church of Christ. That Church of Christ is all of 6 weeks old. They built a church building. The members of the church in Obudu made the bricks and built the church building brick by brick before the first Sunday that those 50 or 60 that were baptized over a 3-week period, 50 or 60 of them were baptized, and they met for their first Sunday in that church building. A few weeks ago, I got to preach, or a week and a half ago, I got to preach in that congregation. And it was amazing to know that the people I was looking at just a matter of weeks ago were all perishing in their sins. But you see, they had this attitude, the people of the school and of the congregation there in Obudu, that they were going to hand out as many life vests as they could. And those people were rescued because of that. No man here understands the poverty or the devastation of the darkness that's in Africa right now. That the church is growing like incredible numbers. The churches are doing an incredible job. 6,000 churches of Christ in Nigeria alone. And they're baptizing folks by the boatloads. And yet, it's such a poverty-stricken place. I was talking with Emmanuel Essien, who is the president of the Bible College there, the Essien Bible College. It's named after his uncle who established that college. I was talking to him about the poor churches in America and about inflation. We were just sitting around an evening meal, and I was talking to him about, the poverty that exists in America and the benevolence program we have for those who are hurting and needing help, and talking with him about that and about inflation how the price of gasoline has gone through the roof, and the price of bread and other groceries is becoming more and more expensive, and just how hard it is for us here in America, how difficult it is for us to send money to Africa. And he said, well, brother, it does sound like America has some poor people in it, but there's an old saying in Africa. There's always an old saying, isn't there? He said, there's an old saying in Africa. No matter how skinny the cow is, it'll never compare to the goat. Meaning that, yeah, we may have skinny cows here in America, but they're trying to survive on goats, and there is no comparison. The poverty that's there is just totally unbelievable. In Ikada-Usan, the first Church of Christ that was established in Nigeria is in Ikada-Usan, and I got to preach there. I literally preached there 5 minutes after I arrived. They got me. It was a several-hour drive from the airport to Ikada-Usan, and I arrived there in the evening for a huge convention that was there. There were Christians from literally all over the region. Some had walked 5, 10, or more miles to be there at the church. I said walked, not drived. They walked maybe 10 miles to get to the church building. There were between 1,000 and 2,000 people meeting in this church building. And for those that weren't in the Bible class, the wood that you see, the bamboo that you see, they're doing a remodeling project on that church. And as you see, it is the first congregation established in Nigeria and West Africa. This fellow right here is Prince Abudu, and he was our guide and our chaperone throughout the entirety of our trip. Well, throughout our trip, both Dan Goodyear, who is my mentor over there, doing the work that I'll be doing in his behalf when he retires shortly, he and I went there to admonish the churches to step up to giving to schools and students and their preachers. And so we began with me preaching at this congregation. The night that I preached, there was, as I said, between 1,000 and 2,000 people there, and we baptized 28 people, by the way, that night. When the song of invitation came after my sermon, there were 28 that responded to be baptized. It was an awesome experience to take the confession of 28 souls that were wanting to be rescued from the doom that they stood for. Dan's message, as he preached to the congregations and the schools that we went to throughout the time we were there. And by the way, our goal in going was to preach to schools and the congregations associated with those schools. We weren't really per se doing mission work. We weren't reaching out as missionaries, so to speak. We were there as representatives of Sunset International Bible Institute and the methods by which we were going to use to help strengthen the schools and the churches there. And this was all a part of my new position with Sunset as Dean of Ministry Training. The Sunset International Bible Institute has invited me to work with them in a project called 10,000 Voices. And basically is helping to prepare these schools to prepare 10,000 gospel preachers to go out into these congregations. And they're going to have to learn to earn their own living in doing so. They'll be bivocational ministers. But Dan spent his messages focused on telling the churches that they're going to need to step up and be able to help these congregations to grow and flourish. And that was pretty much the focus of his sermons. My sermons were focused mainly at the schools, and this is a photo of me preaching at one of those schools. The picture at the bottom is the graduating seniors, all receiving bachelor's degrees. By the way, you'll notice a woman there. That right there is a female. She did not receive a bachelor's degree for preaching, but she's going to be a great teacher of women throughout Nigeria. She'll be a leader among women in Nigeria. But in any case, they had quite a graduating class, and I spent most of my time either preaching to churches, but also to the students and their faculty and the churches associated with those schools. And my task was to talk about the idea of bivocational ministry. This was another graduating class. In Matthew chapter 9, in verse 37, Jesus said, "The harvest is indeed plenteous, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest that He might send forth laborers into His harvest." And so I spoke to those who were becoming laborers in the harvest. and describe to them how that they have the right to make a living. This is a graduation ceremony, by the way, at one of those colleges. And to talk with them about the fact they have every right to be able to make a living from their gospel preaching. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 11 that they who proclaim the gospel should live by the gospel. It is a mandate to churches that they should pay the salary of a preacher so that he might be able to have to be able to preach. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul says the laborer is worthy of his hire. A quotation from something that Moses had written in the book of Deuteronomy. So it is that the laborer is worthy of his hire. However, in most of the churches throughout America, literally half the churches in America, the preachers do not receive an income the way that I do here. Y'all pay me an income that is quite sufficient to supply Brenda and I and my family with all that we need. But fully 1/2 of all the churches of Christ in America, the men that stand in the pulpit, are working a second job. I did it myself for 27 years. I've told you before, I was a paramedic firefighter while also a preacher. And the lion's share of my income came from that. There were churches that were inviting me to come to be their preacher. And in the conversation, they would ask me, how much money do you want us to pay you? And I would tell them, well, I have all the money I need, but I intend you to pay me all that you can. And that happened. Churches that could not supply me with enough income gave me what they could give me to help support me. And then I worked a second job in the process. Well, Sunset and my dream and the schools that I visited, it is their dream to send out 10,000 preachers over the next 10 years. And I witnessed hundreds graduating over the last couple weeks. We're wanting to graduate 1,000 a year. And if we succeed in doing that, there's no way the churches in Nigeria or the churches in America could possibly support all those preachers. And so Sunset is going to be doing all it can to supply two things. The training that not only trains men to preach the gospel over there, but also the training of income, how they can work jobs that might very well support them while they're there trying to preach the gospel. It's called bivocational ministry. And Sunset will be doing all it can to, first of all, provide curriculum for training, and then also paying for the tools that they'll need to be able to do those things. And so I encouraged those students that I spoke with in that Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28 says, let a man labor doing honest work with his own hands so that he may have something to share with anyone who is in need. That text is not just talking to members in the pew, it's talking to the preachers in the pulpit as well, that they need to labor with their hands, and indeed they do. What you're looking at right now is a plantation at one of those schools. Some of the schools have already started implementing some of this. They're supporting themselves. Rather than having money coming from America, some of the schools I visited aren't receiving a dime from America. But this is one of those schools where they're self-sufficient. This is a plantation that I was on. I walked for a couple hours through this plantation. They grow yams that are not yams like our yams, totally different. But they grow yams and a thing called cassava, cocoa, bananas, plantains. There's a whole list of things, most of which are tall, bushy, tree-like things. Most of these plants are. And so as we walk for 2 hours through this plantation, and those who are in the Bible class, you're getting ready to get a refresher on what I said. But as I walked through this jungle plantation, I kept looking around and noticing, you see the ground vegetation? The ground vegetation right here. I looked around and thought, this would be a good place for snakes. And so I asked Prince Ugby, who was our guide throughout the time we were there, I asked him, what kind of snakes do you have around here in this jungle? And he said, well, green mambas and cobras. And he said other snakes, but I don't remember what they were. He had me at green mambas and cobras. And by the way, he didn't tell me that until we got back to the bus. I was literally standing right where I'm at right now when I asked him about that. He didn't tell us that before we took that 2-hour walk through the jungle plantation. But in any case, so they're growing their own foods, and that's one way in which a guy might be able to make a living and also preach the gospel, is by growing his own foods. But that, of course, requires him to have a farm, a piece of property. And so Sunset's going to be helping out with some of that in getting property and helping them get set up in farming where they're preaching at. But not only that, but also sewing. I told you that this outfit was custom made for me. Literally, this is where it was made at. This guy right here is sewing on my jacket or my pants, I don't know which, but he's sewing on that right now. He worked all night long making this. Him and also a couple other students. He's a student in the school. And this right here is the dress that Brenda is now wearing. They custom made this. Well, if we can teach these men and their wives how to sew and how to make garments, then when they get out preaching, they can make a living at that. And so Sunset's helping that be provided. That's going to be my task, is seeing to it. I'm not going to be teaching anybody to sew, by the way. That's not something I know how to do. But I'll be seeing to it that there are people who know how to sew, who are there teaching. I mean, as you can see, this school already has sewing machines right there. You can see they already have like 6 or 8 sewing machines that Sunset has provided, and they're learning how to teach sewing to these people so that these students will be able to make a living from sewing, but not only from sewing. And I wish you could see this picture. Those in the back I know can't. But can anybody read what that says right there? Cybernet. And this right here, anybody can read what that says? Computer accessories. This is a Best Buy store. This is where the Geek Squad's at in Obudu. It's not really Best Buy. But it turns out that everybody in Nigeria has a cell phone. How many here have a cell phone right now? You raise your hand. Raise your hand. Yeah, it's like everybody in the room. Guess what? If I was standing in front of an audience of 1,000 in Nigeria and said the same question, guess how many would raise their hand? Every one of them would. Every one of them would. It just, you may live in a grass-thatched roofed hut with a dirt floor in one room, but you've got yourself a cell phone. The thing about it is, though, is that the people of Nigeria, they can afford one cell phone. If it breaks, they're in trouble. So there needs to be people who repair cell phones. We're back to these student preachers. So Sunset is going to be providing the training for student preachers to learn how to repair cell phones. And it really doesn't take much technology or much education to do so. It turns out that as I was preparing to go to Africa a week or so before I left, my phone was messed up. It was not, well, I was trying to get my phone out. I guess you don't need to see my phone. You just believe me, I've got one. Oh, there it is. So my phone's battery was only lasting for like 2 hours. And I got to thinking, I'm going to be in Africa. I'll be in the middle of nowhere. I won't have any battery charging going on. And so I went to the Verizon store in Waco, and I said, I'm going to need a new iPhone. And I said, so I'm here to buy a new iPhone. And I explained to him the reason why was because my battery would only last for about 2 hours after a full charge. And I said, so I'm going to buy a new iPhone from you unless you talk me out of it. And the guy literally looked me in the face. This is a Verizon store salesman. Looked me in the face and said, well, I'm going to talk you out of it. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, you don't need a new iPhone. You need a new battery. I didn't know you could put a new battery in an iPhone. I don't even know how to take it apart. He said, yeah, Bob's Battery. Just write that down. Y'all take notes. Bob's Battery in Waco. I took my phone to Bob's Battery shop in Waco, and this young little guy he took my phone, and 30 minutes later, he had a brand new battery in my phone. And I was off and running for $28. I repaired my cell phone. And I was just giddy about it. So I'm just saying that there are ways in which preachers in Africa can make a living, and that's what the point of it is all about. This picture right here is of brick makers. The guy right here is the director of the school, and that's him right there. These are bricks that they made by hand. That church that I preached in, I said at BB, that brand new congregation that they baptized 50 people in 3 weeks. I preached to about 60 of them in a church building there that was built by hand during the weeks that led up to their evangelistic work. And they built it. This right here is not that church, but they're building an apartment complex right there with handmade bricks. That guy right there is pressing out bricks, one brick at a time with a hand press. In any case, they can do that over there, and these men might very well make their living doing that as bivocational preachers. I spent time talking with these preachers about the fact that bivocational ministry is a very common thing. I explained to them how that Jesus was a bivocational minister. Recall what he grew up as. What was his father's profession? Carpenter. And guess what they knew Jesus as? Those that ridiculed Jesus or wanted to make fun of him, what did they call him? Son of a carpenter or a carpenter. Jesus was bivocational. But then also there was others. The Apostle Peter is known as the big fisherman. You know why he was called the big fisherman? Because he was a fisherman. Remember Matthew chapter 4 when Jesus called him in verse 18, Jesus said he found them mending their nets. And he told these fishermen, Peter, James, and John, come follow me and I'll make you what? Fishers of men. Do you know they didn't stop fishing though? In John chapter 21, after the resurrection of Jesus, guess where we find Peter after the resurrection? He's at his fishing boat and he's fishing. The Apostle Peter was a bivocational minister, but then also Luke. Luke in Colossians chapter 4, the guy who wrote the book of Luke and the book of Acts, he's known as the beloved physician. You know why they called him the beloved physician? Because he was a doctor. He was a bivocational minister that could support himself by practicing as a physician, while he also traveled with Paul in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 11. He was in Paul's preaching entourage. And then, of course, there's the Apostle Paul himself. In Acts chapter 18, it says in verse 1 and following that Paul was at Corinth with a couple named Priscilla and Aquila, depending on which part of the country you're from. But in any case, I know him as Aquila. But Priscilla and Aquila were tent makers by trade. So was Paul. And Paul, it says, while he lived at Corinth, was making tents for a living. Paul was a tent maker, a bivocational minister. I'm saying all that to say it's a very biblical concept that preachers be able to support themselves to some form or fashion in a bivocational ministry. And so I was encouraging these fellas, as I am right here in this group, encouraging them to understand that they can support themselves if they're willing to. I also told them that you may not be able to be paid an entire salary by the churches of Nigeria, or even Nigeria, and even by U.S. churches. If we're going to create 1,000 new preachers every year, those preachers are going to have to be, to some degree, self-sustaining. And I encouraged them that Sunset was going to help to pay for some of this training that they were going to need to get. That Sunset would help them learn how to do trades and supply them with the tools to be able to do that work and to help them become self-supporting. The schools in Nigeria, in the same way, have to become self-sustaining. They cannot count on, part of my mandate is not only to prepare these men to be bivocational ministers and to give them the supplies they need to do that, but another part of it is for these schools to become self-sustaining. I'm supposed to be helping them to establish more satellite schools in other cities, so that as we multiply the numbers of schools of preaching, there's no way the church in America can afford to pay for all the schools and all the training. And so the schools themselves will have to become, to some degree, self-sustaining, and Sunset will be helping with that happen as well. All of what I'm saying today is, in regard to these schools and these men preaching, is there's an old saying, if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. But if you give that man a fishing pole and teach him how to use it, he'll eat for a lifetime and feed his family as well. That's my mandate. That's what Sunset International Bible School is doing in Africa. A servant attitude of helping men to learn how to fish and support themselves. That's my message for you today. That men of compassion need to rescue the perishing. And I'm telling you that the men in Africa are prepared to share their life vests with those that are perishing. That the men who are training in schools across Nigeria and the rest of West Africa are making huge sacrifices. They're giving up whatever household and whatever income they have in order to go to school, train to be gospel preachers, and at the same time have to train to learn how to do some trade so that they'll be able to both preach and make their own living at the same time. That, my friends, is being a servant. That is what the whole thing is about, learning how to be servants. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 43, a text that I shared with virtually every school I spoke at, a text that I shared says this, it's Jesus talking, "Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be the servant of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give His life a ransom for many. Brethren, if we're going to call ourselves Christians, if we're going to say we're following Jesus, if we're going to say we're trying to be as Jesus was, a servant, then we got to be willing to share our life vests with others. We got to be willing to be servants ourselves. That it's not that we're here to be served. The Church of America has so much a mentality of we're here to be served. And we want people to serve us and provide us our needs. And what needs to happen is each of us need to become servants. To make an illustration of this, Jesus in John chapter 13, in the upper room, the night that He was betrayed, He took a towel and He washed the feet of the disciples. He was willing to wash the feet of the disciples. And when He got done with doing that, He turned to the disciples and said, "Do you know what I've done?" I can just imagine one of them raising their hand and saying, I know, you washed our feet." He said, "No, that's not what happened." He said, "You call me Lord and Master, and rightfully so, for that I am. And if I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet." That is people being willing to serve others. That's my message to you. If you're sitting here right now as a Christian, let me offer you a life vest that you could share with others. And if you're not a Christian, you've never come to Jesus, you haven't been baptized into Christ, then we're about to sing a song of invitation, and life vests are available. You'll be able to come to Jesus, to be rescued from perishing in sin, if you'll repent and be baptized this day as we stand and as we sing.
What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other path I know. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. For my pardon this I seek. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. For my cleansing this I plead. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other path I know. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Nothing can for sin atone. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Naught of good that I have done. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other path I know. Nothing but the blood of Jesus.
When I got back home from Africa, my first opportunity to get a hold of a hamburger was Saturday at lunchtime. And I shoved my face into a hamburger with great zeal. I am so grateful to be home and to be back among you loving brethren and to rest back on my own comfortable bed. It was good to be back home. So grateful to see you this morning. God bless each one of you with a great week this week.
Keeping with this morning's lesson, let's sing the first verse of number 639. Number 639. After which we'll be dismissed in prayer. First verse of number 639. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, snatch them in pity from sin and the grave. We for the daring one, lift up the fallen, tell them of Jesus the mighty to save. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save.
Let us pray. Lord, we thank you for your mercy and your grace. Lord, we thank you for the many blessings that you bestow upon us. Lord, we ask you to forgive us when we take for granted those many blessings, for we know that there are many that do not have the blessings that we have. Lord, we thank you for all. We know that all good and perfect things come from above. Lord, we thank you for Brother Cliff and the message that he brought to us, as it is an encouragement to us. Let us go forth and be an encouragement to others through our actions and the words that we speak. Lord, we know of those that are sick. We ask you to heal them if it be thine will, for we know that thou art the great physician. Lord, we ask you to comfort those that have lost loved ones. Comfort them in only a manner that you're able to do. Lord, we thank you for this great Lord's Day, and we ask you to bless each and every one as they depart and go forth to their journeys, on their journey. Lord, we ask you to forgive us when we fall short of your expectations. All of these things we ask of you in Jesus' name, amen.